Okay, well, welcome to our February Insights Luncheon. We're very happy to have with us today Dr. Griffith and his longtime partner, I believe, Bobby Sanderson, who's going to be running interference for you today, right?
Okay.
I'm not going to talk much about him because he is going to talk about himself for the next half hour. But we do know that Dr. Griffith has done a lot in this community outside even of Plymouth Harbor, which I hope he tells us about during this half hour. So please welcome Dr. Griffith and Mr. Sanderson.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you for the honor and privilege of being invited to this group today. I turned 90 years old last August, and it made me think very deeply about my place in the long stream of humanity. I was born in 1927, and I was the youngest of 10 children. My mother was 39 at the time. My father was 49. Being the 10th child of a mother who herself was the 7th child in her family produces a wide span in time. You might not believe it, but my grandfather fought in the Civil War. Now, here's the story. He was born in 1845. 16 years later, 1861, was the Civil War. He enlisted in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, served for 4 years, and then was discharged and moved to New York City, where he worked as a trolley conductor on the 2nd Avenue trolley that ran from Harlem, if you know New York, down to the Bowery, down to the southern end of Manhattan. And he went back and forth every day. That was his job. And my mother, Matilda Kelly, was born in 1888, the youngest of 7 children. So then, and then also, I'm one of the youngest veterans of World War II. Would you believe I enlisted in the Navy in January of 1945? The war was still on. The Allied forces were marching toward Berlin. The war would end in Europe in April of 1945, shortly after I went in. I didn't see any action, but technically I'm a veteran of the World War II. And then a few months later in August, they dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I still served after that, but the war was over. At the time the war ended, I was being trained as a medic. I was a super duper first aid man, and I was being trained to land with Marines on amphibious landings in the Pacific, because they figured it was going to take another 2 years to win the war in the Pacific. They didn't know about the atom bomb, which was a surprise when that dropped in August. So growing up as the youngest of 10 children was unusual. I always felt so young. I was the youngest of 10. I was the youngest in class all the way through school. I graduated high school at age 16, college at 20, and medical school at age 24. My father died in 1935 when I was 8. My mother died in 1940 when I was 12. So at 12 years old, I had no parents. My oldest sister, Catherine, who was a heroine in my life, was 28 years old. She was a school teacher in Mount Vernon, New York, and she was appointed my legal guardian. And she really was very good to me. People ask me, why did you become a doctor? Well, I grew up on a street. The street I grew up in had many physicians, 6 or 8 physicians. At that time, the doctors lived in their homes and had the office on a little side porch. And there were about 5 or 6 of them in my town who worked that way. But I grew up around these doctors. They were always friendly to me. They always said hello to me when they drove by in the car. I grew up listening to adult conversations at home, or my older brothers and sisters, and I didn't get to speak much. I mean, my opinion wasn't sought about anything. And along the way, later in life, it was very interesting. I had a psychiatrist friend. We were talking about what got you into medicine and what did. She said, I know why you got into medicine. He said, nobody would listen to you when you were at home. He said, you were there with all that crowd of people, and nobody paid any attention to you. So you said to yourself, I'll do something where people listen to me, and they'll pay me for it. Anyway, that was one interpretation of why. But when I was 12 years old, it was a critical point in my life. I was graduating. All of my brothers and sisters, all 10 of us, went to the same Catholic parochial school in Mount Vernon, and the pastor, Father O'Mara, had seen us all go through. When I came along at the last one, he said, you know, none of these Griffith kids have become either a priest or a nun. He said, Jimmy's our man. So the priest lined up and had me take the examination for Cathedral College, which was a special prep school in New York City, right in back of St. Patrick's Cathedral on Madison Avenue. It's now the Palace Hotel. And and I took the examination and passed it. And I was just finishing the 8th grade, ready to start in September down there. And Father O'Mara came up to me. My mother was on her deathbed. She was dying of cancer. She would die on July 15th. So he came up sometime in late June and told her, now, don't worry about Jimmy. Jimmy's taken care of. He said, we have him a scholarship to Cathedral College. He'll be a priest, and he'll be praying for you, and everything will be okay. So my mother died with that thought. About the time my mother died, the same time, I received word that I'd won a scholarship to Iona Prep, which was a Catholic prep school in New Rochelle, New York, nearby, which was so I never thought I'd get in there, but I won a full scholarship to the school. And so that I did go there, and it was a great experience. Only 50 in my class. Everybody went to college. The whole class was accepted at colleges, the best colleges. And I went there. When I graduated in 1944, it was shortly after D-Day, June 6, 1944. I graduated that month, and I should backstep a little bit. I had to make a decision whether I was going to go to Cathedral College or the priesthood or to Iona Prep. I now had 2 full scholarships. So I agonized over the decision and didn't get much advice from anybody. And I finally had decided on my own I was going to go to Iona. So I canceled it. I broke the heart of this priest, Father O'Mara, who was the pastor. But I think I did the right thing. So that was a big fork in the road for me, where I decided to go to Iona. But since then, I've always been interested in religion, in faith, in what this world is all about. I'll come to that a little bit at the end. So that while in Iona, I had to ride it was 4 miles. I rode my bicycle every day, 4 miles back and forth to school. Except if it were raining, there were buses I could take, but that was expensive, and I was saving money because my father died in 1935, and he was very successful up until the Depression in 1929. I should say, he was an immigrant. My father was born in Ireland, and he left Ireland when he was 16 years old in 1895 and came to Ellis Island and was alone. He was all alone, and he was hired on the dock as he left Ellis Island. He was hired by a grocery company, James Butler Grocery Company, after whom I was named, incidentally, James Butler. So that it was he was hired as a clerk at age 16, and he went to work and he worked as a clerk, and then he went up the line. To make a long story short, by the time he was 42 years old, he was president of the company. He was a very charming guy. I didn't know him well, but everybody spoke well of him. And he had very good language skills, having come from Ireland. And he had very good people skills. He was very good with people. And he became manager of the store, then regional manager, then he was president of the company with 300 stores over the whole New York, Long Island, New Jersey area. And the whole thing fell apart in 1929 when the Depression occurred. My father, it was the only job he ever had was with that company, and all of his investments, all of his planning, he was with was stock in the company. And the stock, of course, was worthless. His heart was broken, and he lived another few years, tried to get started again, but never made it. But the times were difficult. And when he died in 1935. While at Iona Prep, I made good friends there and had a good experience. And when I graduated, it was 1944, the war was on, and most of my class went into they had a program called Army and Navy A12V12, Army and Navy Officers Training Program, where you left and they'd put you through college and you were on track to become an officer. You finished college and then you would be an officer. And many of my classmates were in that program. The thing is, you had to be 17 years old on July the 1st. I was not 17 yet. I graduated. I was about fourth in my class, but I couldn't go in because I wasn't of the right age. So the headmaster of the school said, well, go into a college where they do have this program, and maybe we can arrange to get you absorbed into the program when you turn 17 later. So most of my class, they went to Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Cornell, University of Rochester, Tufts, many fine schools. I couldn't get into that program. So I did have a New York State scholarship, which entitled me to go to any college in New York State with a tremendous help. It was a 50 or 60% tuition rate coverage. And so I went to Columbia because it was nearby. I could commute to school from where I lived. It was only 12 miles away. And it also had a Navy training program, which I hoped to be absorbed into. But when I turned 17, I called the headmaster of the school, the Iona, and he said, well, let me check. I did have a friend who was an admiral in the 3rd Naval District down there in New York. He called me back a couple of days later and said, sorry, Jim. He said, the admiral was sent out to sea. I don't have anybody there, but carry on. You'll do fine. Stay at Columbia. So that's what I did. I finished 1 year at Columbia. The following January, I was 17 years old, approaching 18. The war was still on. That's when I enlisted. So I enlisted in the Navy and signed up in the hospital corpsman training program because I had finished 1 year of pre-med at Columbia, and that gave me a little bit of a head up in getting started through that. Well, I finished at Columbia. No, I went in the Navy. I went in the Navy after I finished 1 year of college from 45 to 44 to 45. And I was in the Navy in January of 45. I said that then the war ended, and then after the war, they were decommissioning these naval bases, and I was first put through training, and I learned a lot about first aid and emergency care. But they also trained me in pharmacy, X-ray, and laboratory in about an 8-week course. I don't know how they did it. They gave me all this, and I was able to take X-rays, do basic laboratory stuff, and even run a blood bank. I did type in cross-matching of blood for transfusions. So that I learned a tremendous amount in this maybe 2 months treatment program up in the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So after that, they sent me to Iceland, where they were decommissioning a large hospital. Was up there in Reykjavik, Iceland. So I was up there for 9 months, and then the war had been over for a year or so when I was discharged and came home and went back to Columbia, finished college, and I still graduated when I was 20 years old. And I had a year and a half in the Navy in between there. So how I did it, I don't know, but that's what the numbers say. So I graduated from college in 1948 at age 20 and was accepted in medical school, which was in Brooklyn, New York, State University of New York in Brooklyn. So I went to medical school there, and while there, I had a leg up because I was able to get help on my tuition by being employed by hospitals. I had skills that I could do laboratory, X-ray work, so they'd make a deal. I'd live in the hospital in the interns' quarters. I'd cover at night. I'd cover the emergency room for X-rays, laboratory work, blood transfusions, and could do that every other night and every other weekend. Meantime, I got room and board and laundry and everything else, so that helped me a lot. And I also had the GI Bill of Rights, for which I'm eternally grateful, that helped me to go to medical school. So anyway, moving along, in 1953, while I was a resident physician after graduating, I was a resident physician in Hartford, Connecticut, and in internal medicine. And while there, I was married, and I had 3 children who are now age 58, 60, and 62. They're growing up. And I started medical practice in Norwalk, Connecticut in 1955. And I spent 1 year there as a resident physician. It was a small hospital of only 200 beds, and I was the resident doctor there. And I took care of patients that couldn't afford a private doctor. They'd say, went to the house doctor. That was me for that year. So during that year, I did that, and with the help of a lot of the senior doctors who were practicing in town, and also they were good to me. If they, if there was a problem in the hospital, the doctor was at the country club dance, or somebody said, "Jim, would you take a look at Mrs. Jones up in room 23 or something, and give me a call back?" And I'd go and see her and advise them and save him a trip to go over to see the patient. And I developed a lot of trust from the doctors who would trust me to do that. And then when I finished there, I said, "Well, what'll I do?" My wife was pregnant with my first child, and I wanted to go to work, had to get started, because I was, at that time, an intern. When I started in Hartford, my salary was $50 a month. I went to Norwalk, Connecticut, because it had the highest salary in the state of $250 a month is what I got there at that time. And that was the highest in the state. That's what made me go there. I didn't know anybody there at all. So after I finished a year as a resident doctor, a house doctor, I decided to open up practice. And because I knew all the doctors in town, they fed me, and I just instantly had a busy practice there. And I was busy from the first couple of months. My practice built up quickly. And so I stayed there, and I practiced there for 40 years. And while in practice, I was very busy. I was involved. I served as the secretary of the medical staff. I was president of the local Norwalk Area Heart Association, the Christmas Seals group. I was on the board of many things. I was on the board of the County Medical Association. In 1958, I was medical director of civil defense. At that time, it was the height of the Cold War, and everybody was worried about a bomb dropping. We were 50 miles from Times Square, and they said it would take about 7 minutes if they dropped a bomb on Times Square. 7 minutes, it would be radiating all of Norwalk, where I was. So I was director of civil defense, about 29 years old. They couldn't get, somebody asked me to do the job, and I did it and went to conferences and read up on it and learned what was going on in that field. And some people had shelters in their backyard. Some people had dug shelters underground. Many people had set up places in their basement where they set up 2 weeks of food supply in case there was an atom bomb drop. And this went on, and finally it got ridiculous the way people were talking, because there was no place to protect everybody if an atom bomb were to come. But the civil defense kind of fizzled out after that, if you remember that. And nobody talked about it anymore. But it was a big deal at the time. So I was in that, and I also was medical director of Notre Dame Convalescent Home, which was a 60-bed skilled nursing facility in Norwalk. And I started there in 1958, and was there for about 30 years or so as medical director. I took an interest in alcoholism because when I was the house doctor in Norwalk, I'd have patients who'd just go through a revolving door. We'd get them sobered up, they'd go out, and they'd be back in a couple of weeks later. And finally, one time I called up, I said, let me find out about what AA is. So I called up AA, and this lovely lady from Westport, Connecticut came down to see how she could help. So I told her I had this patient, his first name was Bob, who had fallen asleep. He had got too much to drink, and he fell asleep in the freight yards in this Norwalk freight yard station, and he got severe frostbite of his toes. And we had cold winters in Connecticut. And he had been about his third time in the hospital, to my knowledge. So I hated to have him go out. So I called up, and this lady, Betty Maney, came, and from the AA, and she was a successful, she'd been in recovery for 20 years. She said, let me see how I can help. Well, she took him to the Salvation Army. She had friends who got a clothing for him and took him to an AA meeting, and he got started in AA, and he did, I'm not sure how he did over the long term, but he did get a start and he got help. And so it got me interested in AA, and then this Betty Maney, who was in the program, said, gee, it's unusual to have a doctor who's interested in alcoholics. So that she got me to be on the board. They had organized an alcoholism council, which was similar to the Heart Association, cancer, tuberculosis, etc. But they now had one for alcoholism. So they got me on the board of that, and I was very active in that and did a lot of speaking around town and in the high schools about alcoholism and alcohol drugs. So that it got me interested in that, and I would have patients referred to me from AA, and I had a lot of people who were recovering alcoholics, and I was also involved in setting up an alcohol detoxification center in our hospital, which was almost unheard of at that time. It was one of the first ones in the area, so that was opened up, and that's where people could come to detox and get help from AA and get started on a program of rehabilitation. So I have many experiences about my life in medicine. I'm not going to tell you all kinds of stories about that, but it was really a privilege to a sacred trust to take care of people and to incur the trust of people who would come with their problems. And I had just a unique window into the lives and of people as a physician in the town. And being there for 40 years, I knew generations. When I retired, I knew somebody. Well, I knew your grandmother. I took care of her, and I knew 3 generations of people when I was retiring. And when I retired in 1992, I was 65 years old. I was still in very good health, but I was just working furiously. I wanted to slow down. There was no way I could do it. I was making house calls. I had a busy office. I averaged 6 to 8 patients in the hospital at any time, and I was working about 55 hours a week. And I figured, how do I slow down? How do I say I'm going to cut out 10% of these people? I'm not going to see you anymore. Get another doctor. Which ones? How do I do that? So I figured the only way to do that is to step off the treadmill and just retire completely. So I retired in 1992, and I began doing what they call locum tenens. Locum tenens is where locum tenens means to hold the place. And what that is, I worked for an agency the agency was able to secure medical licenses for me in almost any state in the union. And I would go and work for 6 or 8 weeks for Humana or an HMO or for a small community hospital in North Carolina. But I took these jobs for 6 or 8 weeks, and it was fun. I was divorced at that time, and I was single, so it was easy for me to do that. And but I enjoyed the work, and I worked anywhere from for HMOs. I worked for the military. I worked at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and Pensacola Naval Air Force Base, first time in Florida. And I worked at different places. I worked in the prison systems, the prisons in North Carolina and Georgia, and Florida later, yeah. So I did all those things. And then 1997, after retiring a couple of years, I moved to Florida because I figured I had enough of those cold northern winters. I figured I'm going to go to Florida. So I came down here. I did have a relative who lived in the Tampa area. So I came down, I moved down first to Tampa, and then I came down to visit Sarasota one time to hear George Shearing. I was a very fan of his music. I came down to a George Shearing concert at Van Wezel. I said, gee, this is quite a place here, Sarasota. I looked around and came back a couple of weeks later and looked at real estate and bought an apartment across in 988 River Boulevard of the Arts. From my balcony, I could look across and see what's this tall 25-story building sitting over there in the west, and that was Plymouth Harbor. So I found out, looked at that, and that was it. A friend of mine came down to visit me, who happened to be a friend of Jack Dennison, who's still here. And he said, "Oh, I'll hear." I said, "We'll go over and say hello to Jack." So we went over to see Jack Dennison, and that was my first time I was at Plymouth Harbor, which would be about 1997 or so, I think. So, and then when I came here, I also got involved with the Senior Friendship Center here in Sarasota, and I became a volunteer there and worked that in. And after about 10 years, I stopped doing my traveling. I used to travel around to different places, military bases, prisons, short-term assignments as a physician. And I gave that up and just stayed local and was pretty much full-time at the Friendship Center. Not full-time, but 1 day a week I practiced as a volunteer, which I still do. I just completed 20 years as a volunteer at the Friendship Center. And then in...
It's almost 12:30.
Okay.
You wanted to show something.
Oh, yeah, I do. Okay. So then I wanted to show some... Well, I'm close, okay. So in 2005, I moved to Plymouth Harbor. And today I have 3 children who are 58, 60, 62. I have 8 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren. And, of course, with all these siblings, I have 35 nieces and nephews who age from 55 to 79 in age. And many of them were here. I had a wonderful party here. I think I have a picture of it. In last August on my 90th birthday, and I had, how many people came?
46 from across the country.
Yeah, 46 people came from all over the country. So it was very good.
You didn't mention traveling or me.
No, I didn't travel. I didn't get there. When I came to Sarasota, I met Bobby Sanders, introduced to him by Jack Dennison. Jack Dennison introduced me, and that was in 1998, 99. And we've been friends and traveled the world together and have had a very good relationship ever since. I'm sorry I didn't get to you, but I'm working on the time here, yeah. So, let me see. I want to show some pictures because let me see. I'm going to stand up for this because this is my family. This was taken when I was about a year old. That is I, JJG, labeled. And this was taken in about 1928. I was born in 1927. But that's my family. I have there were 4 boys and 6 girls. And
His mother and father.
and mother and father. And mother and father both died young. And so that, let me move along here. That's the house I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York. It had 1 bathroom on the 2nd floor, 5 bedrooms on the 2nd floor, and 2 bedrooms, not 2 bedrooms, but 2 spaces in the attic where I slept for most of my time. And then the 1st floor, of course, was a porch, and et cetera. This is 1945, I went into boot camp. This was me in the boot camp at Geneva, New York, when I was 15 years old. And in 1940, when I got to the prep school, they taught me how to play the clarinet, and they needed clarinet in the band, so I learned that quickly and played in the band. As little Jimmy Griffith, I did a story, it's Phil the Fluter was it. So moving on, this was on travels, traveling the world, and this is a Tower piece of doing my best to keep the world intact. And this is my family. This was taken here in the lower level on August 16th last year. And this is, there's a family plus Bobby, as you see. And this is my, I don't have a pointer here, but this is my son. Somebody said he looks just like me. Do you think so? And this is my daughter. My other son couldn't make it from Connecticut. He was unable to come. And these are these are Greg. This is Greg and his wife Heidi. You know Bobby. And then there are 6 children. And these are my 2 grandchildren. Another one has arrived just last December. So that's that. And this was, what year was that, Bobby? In our travels, Bobby and I, Bobby always a good dancer. I began taking ballroom dancing lessons when I came to Sarasota and loved it. And Bobby and I have done a lot of dancing together. And this was at Burr Island, where the Noel Coward Society sponsored this, and we went to that. And that's that. And then here we are at St. Paul's Church in London, and on the QM2 in the Norway Fjords a couple of years ago.
Last summer.
Last summer. Let's go back. And this is dancing on the QM2. And this is a picture visiting New York City with my granddaughter Susanna, who's just graduated from NYU Law School, and Bobby's granddaughter Katie, who was a art conservator in conservative photography at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. And you know these 2 characters. Now, I want to talk about Ellis Island briefly, because my father, I never knew much about him. He, I'm getting over time. I've got 2 minutes or so, okay. But my father left Ireland when he was 16 years old. He never talked about it. I don't know anything about what happened, but I know he arrived in 1895. Ellis Island opened in 1892, and the Immigration Act of 1891 provided that everybody was detained at Ellis Island until they were cleared. The immigration officials at the port of entry had authority to examine them, and they could reject anyone for bad health, bad morals. They were detained until approved. The steamship companies would be required to return the immigrants if they weren't accepted. So there was only 1% or 1 or 2% were rejected, so that they had to be careful because they were responsible to bring you back home. If you weren't accepted at Ellis Island, they had to take you back to the port. That all changed along the way, you know. Immigration is very different now, but my father came in. I don't know what it was like. I don't know what it was like on that ship, but I see pictures sometimes, movies about immigration, and my father never talked about it, what happened on that ship. But he came over here at age 16, he was, when he came. He landed, he got a job as a delivery boy for a grocery company, and in 1895. And by 1935, he was president of the company with 360 stores. Now, I don't know how he did that, but he did it. And then the store, the company fell apart in 1928, 29 when they had the crash. There was a recession, and he lost everything. Everything he had, he invested back in the company in stock, and the stock was worthless. So that if he had diversified, I might have, the life might have been different. But in any event, that was the story on that. And this was dawn. Last time we were in Europe, I came back at 6 a.m. in the morning. I said, I'm going to get up, and I wanted to see the view that my father had when he came into New York Harbor in 1895. And this is the view. I took this picture a couple of years ago. Bobby, you were with me? Last summer. But that's a picture entering New York Harbor at 6 a.m. dawn. And it's always wonderful to come home here.
Please, if you feel that you have to go back, please feel welcome to do that, because you won't be rude. We do know that we're supposed to end at 12:30, but if others have questions, will you stay for a minute and answer some
Oh,
questions?
yeah, sure.
Well,
went to Iceland. They said said you traveled to Iceland. How did
Yeah.
you get there?
I got there in a boat, left from, they had a staging area in New York City at Pier 92, and everybody sat there, and every morning they would call out a list of numbers to report. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I reported, and they had a bus going to Bayonne, New Jersey, where there was a ship going to Iceland. And it was a refrigerated ship owned by United Fruit Company that was taking supplies up to Newfoundland and Iceland to our bases. So I went with that. There were about 15 of us on that ship, and that was a rocky ride. It was a small ship, and bad weather, and I think that almost everybody on the ship was sick except me. For some reason, I didn't get seasick, so I had lots of food, and I could eat well, and nobody else could eat. So how do you? But in any event, I didn't get sick. It took 13 days.
Wow, 13 days of being
And the ship was rough. It was February on the North Atlantic, and we did a lot of rock and roll, back this way and pitching, and it was an experience.
Other questions?
Not a question, just a comment. I spent a lot of time in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Did you?
I'm from Connecticut, and I actually had an apartment. One of my first apartments was within, a half a block of the hospital. And I'm trying to think of the years where.
Claremore Drive.
In the 70s.
Yeah. Oh, in the 70s.
Were you there in the 70s?
No, yes, I was there. Yes, I was, but I was.
Isn't that funny?
By that time, I was successful. I had a nice house in the north end of town, up off West Rocks Road.
Very good. Mentioned the clinic. You were in Silvermine?
No, I didn't live in Silvermine, but I know Silvermine. Yes.
Yeah, that's where we were.
Yeah.
And it was very nice area.
Yeah, well, that's a coincidence. It was a good area. They were very good to me. I went there. I didn't know a soul. I took the job because it was the best-paying hospital in Connecticut, and they were paying $250 a month, and other places were. Hartford paid $50 a month.
You helped start the clinic.
And what?
You helped start the clinic. Your clinic.
Oh yeah, that was later. That was something. Yeah, that was not the hospital. Yeah. And then I was first of the Norwalk Medical Group. You probably knew them. Maybe you had a physician there. But I was one of the organizers of the Norwalk Medical. 6 of us got together to say, let's get a group together. We're over in solo practice so that we could cover each other, and also we could buy equipment. We were able to buy our own X-ray machine and put in a laboratory, and we did that together. And that was the Norwalk Medical Group down on Cross Street.
And we were trying to get up that hill to the hospital.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that hill?
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank
Well, that's
you very
interesting.
much, Dr. Griffith. That was very interesting.
Okay.
We didn't know you had such a wide reach throughout your lifetime. Did you always study, was it always internal medicine? Were you always?
Yeah, well, when you had to take a track, when you,
Yeah,
I did internal medicine, and then I did a lot of work with alcohol and alcohol rehabilitation.
okay. Yeah, it sounds like
At the
it.
hospital, I opened up an alcoholism detox unit and rehab center at the hospital. I was involved in that. I was involved with county and state committees on that field.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.